Well, coming to chapter 6, Man and the Battle of Life. Well, after reading this chapter 5 on the Kurukshetra, Sri Aurobindo now, as you can see from the title itself, that was a kind of a universal analysis of Kurukshetra. That means the war and strife as a principle, a universal principle. But now in this chapter he comes closer home. That means he takes up the individual's life, especially from the point of view of the Kurukshetra. Kshatriya, the warrior. So what was the ancient ideal and what is the modern ideal? What was the drawback in the ancient ideal of the Kshatriya and what is the drawback in the modern ideal of man? And then we will see a comparison of man's life. So it is more a chapter that is really coming close to our own individual life. Thus, if we are to appreciate in its Catholicity the teaching of the Gita, we must accept intellectually its standpoint and courageous envisaging of the manifest nature and process of the world. The divine charioteer of Kurukshetra reveals himself on one side as the Lord of all the worlds and the friend and omniscient guide of all creatures, on the other as Time the destroyer, arisen from the destruction of these peoples. The Gita, following in the spirit of the Catholic Hindu religion, affirmed this also as God. It does not attempt to evade the enigma of the world by escaping from it through a side door. Well, you can see immediately how Sri Aurobindo catches up with the argument that we had in the previous paragraphs, or last paragraphs of the previous chapter. That is how we have to accept both sides of the divine and not take in only the beneficent, the beautiful, the good side of the divine, because he is, as we said, he is both the destroyer and the creator. He is the one who preserves, he is the one who slays. So this is the same thing. So he says Gita does not attempt to evade the enigma of the world by escaping from it through a side door. So the Gita also accepts, obviously, the Vedantic solution, that the divine is both the destroyer and the preserver. If in fact we do not regard existence merely as a mechanic action of a brute and indifferent material force, or on the other hand, as an equally mechanical play of ideas and energies arising out of an original non-existence, or else reflected in the passive soul or the evolution of a dream or nightmare in the surface consciousness of an indifferent, immutable transcendence, which is unaffected by the dream and has no real part in it. If we accept at all, as the Gita accepts, the existence of God, that is to say, of the omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent, yet always transcendent being who manifests the world and himself in the world, who is not the slave but the lord of his creative consciousness, nature or force, Maya, Prakriti or Shakti, who is not baffled or thwarted in his world conception or designed by his creatures, man or devil, who does not need to justify himself by shifting the responsibility for any part of his creation or manifestation on that which is created or manifested, then the human being has to start from a difficult act of faith. It's been a very long sentence, you can see, almost the whole page. So now Sri Aurobindo is bringing to the analysis a new element. the element of faith. Now you see, we could have all this, what he has discussed here, all the alternative views we can have of the world. You see, to take up a couple of them, if we do not regard existence merely as the mechanic action of a brute and indifferent material force. So you see, one of the views, which is more or less scientific, is that this world is a creation of energy and it is moving by some material force and it is indifferent. I mean, there's no goal or aim, it just rolls on and rolls on indefinitely without a particular aim to its movement. Or, on the other hand, as an equally mechanical play of ideas and energies arising out of an original non-existence. Some people would say, well, there's actually, this whole world comes from nihil, from non-existence, from asat, and there's apparently no goal of evolution. So these are different views that are coming in. One is the scientific view, the other is the philosophic view, which does not believe in any kind of a person or a personality who is behind this creation. It's just a matter of a non-existence. Or else if we take the other views, I'm skipping a couple of them. If we accept at all, as the Gita accepts, the existence of God, of the omnipresent, omniscient and omnipotent, yet always transcendent being who manifests the world and himself in the world. You see, there is also the concept of the Gita. Why we are saying the concept of the Gita is that, of course, it is very close to what Vedanta says, that God is omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And it's very interesting that we have always talked about these three together: omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. Because if you speak of any one of them, logically you have to come to the conclusion of the other two. You take up any one item of these three, omnipresent or omnipotent or omniscient. This is a very interesting combination. So of course, some time back we had discussed, well, it was a couple of years back, not some time back, because in the Life Divine we had come across this concept that what is omniscient, of course you know, all of you know that, having the full knowledge. The omniscient has got to be logically omnipotent, because this kind of a knowledge bringing in power. You see, this, our little knowledge of computers, of nuclear, of this or that, gives us so much power. So you can raise this whole equation to the infinite level, to the nth level. So as knowledge increases, simultaneously power increases. Or the vice versa, if power increases, knowledge also increases. Of course, you could say, how could there could be a brute power of the asura? Well, we are not speaking about this asuric power, we are speaking about this omnipresent and omniscient. And then there is interesting one, omnipresent, that the divine is omnipresent, present everywhere simultaneously. The important thing is a simultaneous presence of the divine everywhere. Now, if you see a being, we call him the divine, if he is omnipresent, then one who is omnipresent obviously has the omniscience. Because if the divine is here, then he would know what's happening in the hall. If he's there in that garden, he knows what's happening in the garden. If he's there in America, he knows what's happening in Los Angeles. So this omnipresence and omniscience have to go hand in hand. You cannot separate. And omniscience, as we said, automatically leads you to power, omnipotency. So this concept that the divine is all these three, but at the same time, one aspect that normally religions forget is that he is also at always transcendent being. This is typically philosophic of the Vedanta, that the divine is there universally everywhere, but at the same time he has his higher transcendental poise. So the divine is there as a transcendent being who manifests the world and himself in the world, who is not the slave but the lord of his creative consciousness. So what the Gita is telling us here, and Aurobindo is explaining, is this multiple aspect of the divine, the transcendent, the universal, and the indwelling, or what we call the individual. So he's telling us the divine is there everywhere in his creative consciousness, nature, or force. And divine is there everywhere as Maya, Prakriti, or Shakti. Those of you who remember the chapter from the Life Divine, we had the similar title, Brahman, Maya, Ishvara, Shakti, and Purusha, Prakriti. That means the divine has the triple poise of the Brahman, the transcendent being, Ishvara, the universal being, and Purusha, the individual being. So we have Brahman, Ishvara, Purusha, and Brahman, as we know and we have discussed, always acts through his Shakti, his own consciousness power. And this Shakti is called differently on different levels. On the transcendent level, we have Brahman and Maya. On the Ishvara level, we have Ishvara and Ishvari or Shakti. Then on the Purusha level, we have Purusha, Prakriti. So this is the triple formula of this creation. Brahman, Maya, Ishvara, Ishvari, Purusha, Prakriti. But at each level, there is a different role. Because just as we human beings also have a different role in different times of the day. I'm here sitting as a teacher, but in the morning I was there at Aurobindo as a participant in a project. Tomorrow I'm there. You see, we have different aspects. It's the same person, but fulfilling a different role. So similarly, you see, when I go to Aurobindo and I'm having a meeting, I don't talk to them about this Gita and the Brahman and the Maya. So I suspend my knowledge. I kind of withdraw that and put in front another aspect of myself, which is on the practical level, which is really giving suggestions about the project. So the whole thing is different. So similarly, Brahman, when he becomes Ishvara and Ishwari we have, that's a different aspect which is convenient, which is necessary for the manifestation of the universe. But when it becomes the Purusha and Prakriti, Prakriti we see becomes what we say, where it is not self-guided. Prakriti becomes in fact even dumb, if I can say that. So although it is the same aspect of Maya, Ishwari and Prakriti, but on the level of Prakriti, the same Shakti becomes dumb. In the sense, it becomes tamasic. And why it becomes, there's a different reason, but we are just discussing the status. So here Prakriti is tamasic, which doesn't have the direction, not the wisdom, not the vision. But the same Prakriti on the higher level, Shakti, has a different role. So Shakti is that conscious power of Ishvara. And Shakti is interestingly a bridge between Prakriti and Maya. That is why we worship in India Shakti. We don't worship Prakriti, nor do we worship Maya. We worship Ishvara, Ishwari. So all the so-called gods and goddesses, whatever gods and goddesses you may name in the country, in our Indian culture, they belong to this Ishvara Shakti level. So you see, it's very interesting to know that. Nobody worships Brahman Maya and nobody worships Purusha Prakriti. Because this is the level where gods exist, and these gods have the function of becoming a link between Purusha Prakriti and Brahman Maya, between the transcendental and the individual. So that is why when Sri Aurobindo talks about the mother as the Ishwari or the Shakti, so it is Shakti which fulfills, because it hears the aspiration of human being, takes it to the transcendent being, Satchidananda. And from Satchidananda it brings back the force, the energy, the boon, and gives it back to the human beings. So Shakti has this, what we say, she is the mediatrix, we call. In Savitri we have this word, and in the mother also, in this book, The Mother, that she is the mediatrix. That means she mediates between the individual and the transcendental, between the lower Purusha and the higher transcendence. So that is the Vedantic concept that we get here, that he is there in everything, in nature or force like Maya, Prakriti or Shakti, who is not baffled or thwarted in his world conception or design by his creatures. Of course, the Purusha or Purushottama is not baffled by his world conception or design, man or devil, who does not need to justify himself by shifting the responsibility. You can now understand, we had discussed this in the previous chapter, that here in Vedanta, our Satchidananda, this concept of Satchidananda does not shift this responsibility for any part of his creation or manifestation on that which is created or manifested. Then the human being has to start from a difficult act of faith. Here, there is no shifting of responsibility, saying, no, all the good I take, all the bad man takes or the devil takes. That means he does not shift the responsibility upon the creatures. So all that is good or bad in this creation, he says, is me. I have done it. So this is the concept that we had taken at length in the previous paragraph, where in India, in our Vedanta, this is the only philosophic thought in the world perhaps which accepts that the Brahman is everything, good and the bad, evil and the good, sorrow and suffering and pain and pleasure and happiness and bliss. So we do not have this concept of shifting the responsibility. Finding himself in a world which is apparently a chaos of battling powers, a clash of vast and obscure forces, a life which subsists only by constant change and death, menaced from every side by pain, suffering, evil and destruction, he has to see the omnipresent deity in it all, and conscious that of this enigma there must be a solution, and beyond this ignorance in which it dwells, a knowledge that reconciles. So man, the human being who believes in the Gita, in fact we would say he is the true Indian in the larger sense, not in the political sense. Indian in the sense of the Hindu, or to use another term, the true Aryan. The true Aryan or the true Hindu, who in spite of all this pain and suffering and death and change, he sees in this world, he lives in this world of pain and sorrow, and yet he believes that there is something beyond. And this beyond, which reconciles, which will bring us beyond this sorrow and suffering, because he stands upon a faith. As I told you, now there is a question of faith. And upon that faith, what does he say? Though thou slay me, yet will I trust in thee. That is the trust. That is the faith. That I will not be baffled by your sorrows and suffering, O God. I'll not denounce you or renounce you saying God is dead because He is not really helping me. In fact, this crisis of faith comes in all our lives. Recently I came across a person who has been a great believer in the divine and a very sincere, very deep believer, I must say. But something happened in the family, a great, I won't say the word calamity, but something of great sorrow. And this is the moment when she was being tested. But immediately we see a change of psychology. He says, I don't believe in the divine. Because why should the divine give me this kind of a problem? I have been so very faithful to the divine. I have really prayed to the divine. I have meditated for the divine. I have been with the divine. With, in the sense, inner being. So when this sorrow and the tragedy struck, the faith gets disturbed. So this, of course, it will be a temporary phase, of course. The person came to speak to us and we said, no, this will pass off. But this is what really is a testing point. That through all this sorrow and suffering, he says, though thou slay me, yet will I trust in thee. That demands an absolute surrender. It's not easy to say that. All human thought or faith that is active and affirmative, whether it be theistic, pantheistic or atheistic, does in fact involve more or less explicitly and completely such an attitude. It admits and it believes, admits the discourse of the world, believes in some highest principle of God, universal being or nature, which shall enable us to transcend, overcome or harmonize these discords, perhaps even to do all three at once, to harmonize by overcoming and transcending. Well, this is the kind of the attitude we need to take in our life on this planet with all its realities. What we need to do is these two, basically, to admit and to believe. I hope you understand why Sri Aurobindo is using this verse. Because it says you admit the discords of the world. That's what we have been told in the previous chapter. That let's not run away from this battlefield, this Kurukshetra of our life. And let's not theorize and romanticize that all God is great and all God is love and beauty. And escape from this reality which is full of war and strife. So we have to admit that there is discord, that this world is not a Jannat, is not a heaven. All the time there is problem. And yet believe in some higher principle of God. So this is the true sadhak. One who knows the problems, one who is living in these problems, and yet he says, no, there is the divine, there is the principle of God, universal being, which shall enable us to transcend, overcome or harmonize these discords. So it is the belief in the divine which will help us to overcome or harmonize. So this is the whole problem of existence. All our sadhana and yoga is nothing but this. That why do we need this principle of God? We call it a principle in the beginning. Then we will see that it is a reality. Then we will see it is the only reality. In the beginning, it's just a mental concept. My parents told me that there is a God, and somebody says there is Christ, somebody says there is the Buddha and Rama. It's only a concept in the beginning. And this concept become stronger and more realistic as we enter life. You see, when you are a student, you hardly think about the divine. You say, okay, I go and pray. When you have the examinations, the principle becomes a reality. You go to God, you go to the temple and you say, oh God, today is my 10th class examination, I want to pass first class there. So the principle is becoming a reality when you are in trouble, when there are testing times. If you are happy-go-lucky at everything, you are a rich guy and with God's grace you have everything, you don't have to pass the test of 12th class examination, but then the principle remains a principle. That is why sometimes, somebody very cleverly put it, that thank God India is not a rich country. Otherwise it would have forgotten its God. Because if we were rich and having the 2 cars and having the bank balance and having your house and having everything beautiful and no problems, we wouldn't have thought of God at all. So somebody said, thank God we are not a rich country. That means thank God we are surviving, but at least with the help and grace and recognition and knowledge and memory of the divine, which is much more important than having the 2 cars and the 2 garages and everything in the bank balance. So he says that this principle will become a reality as we go into life, because life brings you all kinds of problems. And then when you go transcend, if we can do sadhana, then you see, this is normally, everybody does that. Nothing great about it. That you turn to God, as we say. When you turn to God, when you have problems. But a sadhak, a yogi, would take all these difficulties not only to say, okay God, okay the divine, you give me the help and take me through the difficulties. But the sadhak would say, oh Lord, make this difficulty into an opportunity for my growth inwardly, in my faith, in my being, in my trust. So that is the third level, when the difficulty becomes an opportunity to grow. Second level, when the difficulty is kind of what we call here, met with an equalizer called prayer. That's the second level. And the first level, of course, is just a mental concept. Because I was born into a Hindu family, my father said there is Brahman, there is Satchitananda, there is Ishvara, there is Krishna and Rama. You are born and you say there is Christ and Jesus and etc. etc. So this is the growth, the principle, the reality and the only existence. So that would be the peak of the sadhana, when we say all this is nothing but the divine. Then as to human life, in its actuality, we have to accept its aspect of a struggle and a battle mounting into supreme crisis, such as that of Kurukshetra. The Gita, as we have seen, takes for its frame such a period of transition and crisis as humanity periodically experiences in its history, in which great forces clash together for a huge destruction and reconstruction, intellectual, social, moral, religious, political. And these, in the actual psychological and social stage of human evolution, culminate usually through a violent physical conversion of strife, war or revolution. Well, talking about in the same rhythm, now you can understand. First he said in the individual life, all this comes in. The question of difficulties, the question of faith, etc. But then he says, now there is a collective test, a kind of testing the collective body. What is it? Which mounts into a supreme crisis such as that of Kurukshetra. So every nation, every society has to face a collective test. There's no nation in the world, at least I do not know historically if it is feasible, that has not gone through this testing period. So in India we have had one of these testing periods for the Kurukshetra. That is when which is a period of transition and crisis as humanity periodically experiences in its history, in which great forces clash together for a huge destruction and reconstruction. You see, on the collective level also, every country goes through these periods. But we have to come out of this crisis with the faith in the divine. You know, it just lovely to hear when the American president takes an oath. He takes it in the name of God. You have faith in the Lord, faith in God. So whatever may be the democratic principles, there is the recognition of a higher being called God. You may be not believing later on in your life, but at least, behind this country, they recognize the being. So he says, in the name of the divine, we have to go through these tests. So Kurukshetra that comes and clashes and brings forth a destruction, reconstruction, intellectual, social, moral, religious, political. A crisis comes when the whole society undergoes an upheaval. It's not just a small war. It is, as Aurobindo calls, a period of transition and crisis. It's not like fighting the LTT or fighting the Naxals. These are not those periods of transition and crisis. Well, in India we have had this Kurukshetra. In America we have seen the civil rights war that they had for so many years. That is the moment when the soul of the country decides, what shall be my role? What shall be my manifestation in the future? So these are decisive wars. The Russian Revolution also had this kind of a decisive war, where the whole nature, the swadharma of the country changes. You see, after the Russian Revolution, we had this entire communist rule. It lasted so many years, 80, 90 years. So it is as if the nation takes on a different decision that henceforth my role would be this. So those are the periods of transition. Not that every war is a period of transition, but there are some. So he says, these are the things that really culminate usually through a violent physical convulsion of strife, war, or revolution. The Gita proceeds from the acceptance of the necessity in nature for such vehement crisis, and it accepts not only the moral aspect, the struggle between righteousness and unrighteousness, between the self-affirming law of good and the forces that oppose its progression, but also the physical aspect, the actual armed war or other vehement physical strife between the human beings who represent the antagonistic powers. We must remember that the Gita was composed at a time when war was even more than it is now a necessary part of human activity, and the idea of its elimination from the scheme of life would have been an absolute chimera. You see, we are trying, Aurobindo is more or less, you can see, developing the idea of the previous chapter that Gita accepts, in everybody's life there is a critical moral or intellectual or ethical testing period that comes. But not only that, Gita accepts that on the physical level itself. The test comes on the physical level where there is war, where there is the actual armed war or other vehement physical strife. So it is not something to idealize and say there shouldn't be any war. So Sri Krishna in his own time, he takes up war because there are questions in the other book I wanted to read out. People argue, couldn't Sri Krishna avoid this war? Well, this line tells us it is not possible to avoid war. At that time, at least, it says, when the Gita was composed at a time when war was even more than it is now a necessary part of human activity, and the idea To eliminate that would have been an absolute chimera, an absolute illusion. So you see, what we understand, that Sri Krishna could not avoid the Kurukshetra. Well, we have also seen, in fact, on the contrary, Sri Krishna wanted Kurukshetra, because that was the period of transition. And also he wanted physically to gather all these people onto the one war field and eliminate all these people. It might seem morally cruel, but I think I have explained it enough not to repeat that. That the Lord, the avatar, doesn't go by a morality called life and death. Because for him what is important is the establishment of the higher ideal, and for which nature has to give sacrifice. And he takes it up. You see, at that time there were no United Nations organizations or a League of Assembly where the Kauravas and the Pandavas could go and talk it out across the table. The human social development was at such a stage that it had to be done in a parlays, in the war fields. So there were these crucial wars that came up. And a similar question somebody asked me just before the class: couldn't Sri Aurobindo have avoided or done something so that the leaders of the country could have accepted the Cripps proposal? Because we all know the denial of the Cripps proposal brought us to this terrible calamity, this danger, this terrorism, and all that India is facing now. The same question, couldn't Sri Krishna avoid Kurukshetra? He could have worked on the Kauravas, in their mind brought in some psychological change, and then avoided the war. But an avatar, an incarnation, he doesn't work by miracles. He gives a choice to human beings. Because after all, a miracle is bad because it doesn't change one's nature. You may avoid or escape or evade that incident or that event, but the human being will remain the same. So you have to bring out the worst from you and cleanse it, purify it. So that is why neither Sri Krishna nor Sri Aurobindo worked on the minds of the Kauravas or on the minds of the so-called Indian leaders at that time. In fact, when he sent that Cripps proposal, he said, I knew it would be rejected. And yet he sent it. Because he says, on the divine providence heights, one has to put in the truth. Because it is this truth that will battle all the falsehood that is going to come about. So a divine truth, a divine force which he put in, and also which he really manifested in his 15th of August message, where he says partition will and must go. So that is the divine decree. So when the divine decree comes in, so that opposes all these forces. So today what you are seeing, the parlays between the so-called foreign ministers and prime ministers of these two countries, Pakistan and India, is happening because somebody had put in the divine decree at that time. Otherwise no one spoke in those times, even in 47, the day India got independence, that Pakistan and India will be reunited once again. No one dared to think of this. They thought it is a reality once for all and we are a divided country. But here is the divine decree which says, no, it is a temporary human failure that it could not receive the divine verdict. But the divine is not going to take revenge on the Congress people and say, hey, you are not listened to me, so you go to hell. He leaves them to their own sorrow and suffering. Because when a great rishi speaks, he speaks with the wisdom of the future. But humankind does not see the future. It sees only the present, the past, and its motivations. So unfortunately, but divine has all the patience. So with all the sorrow and suffering, still he tries to guide us with the minimum most of damage. So I would say, had not Sri Aurobindo put in that verdict that the partition will and must go, maybe even the 60 years wouldn't have been sufficient. We would have to last another 100 years before we even came to talking across the table. So we have to understand that neither Krishna nor Sri Aurobindo tried to avoid war. Is that all right? If this is the way that evolution will go faster, let that be Kurukshetra. And if this is the way that things will be worked out, somewhere he does mention that there was some problem that had to be worked out, both in India and Pakistan. The problems of religion, the problems of fanaticism. You see, in those 47, there was no Hindu fanaticism. But later on, Hindu fanaticism also came up, as in Islamic fanaticism also comes up today. So you see, this element of the fanaticism had to be brought up and eliminated once for all on the human consciousness level. So maybe the divine thought this antagonism is one quicker method to bring out this negative fanatic element in religions, because that is what is called the purification. So you see, we do not understand. Today what Sri Krishna has done, Sri Aurobindo is explaining. But who is there to explain what Sri Aurobindo has done and why Sri Aurobindo, except for the couple of answers that he gave to the disciples? We don't know. Mother also, of course, she did explain a few things, but nothing very much in detail like we have here. So I think we have to understand that they go by the principle which is the quickest one for the evolution of humankind. Be it war, be it atomic bomb, be it just simple parlays, a simple ambassadors conference, whatever is the means. But the thing is, we resist, the human beings, our mind resists. For example, when there was the first, I don't remember the year now, we had a war with China. 61? 62. 62. So at that time what happened? Mother sent her force to the Indian army, but it's the Chinese who received it. So the divine is not partial. She sent the force, but our Indian army, in spite of their great call of Har Har Mahadeva, they did not receive the Mahadev. It's the Chinese who received the mother's force. So this is what happens in history, that the Sri Aurobindo sent his message and his force, but our Indian leaders did not receive it. So this is the reality. So let's not think why Sri Aurobindo did not or why Sri Krishna did not. And therefore we have a strange mystery, but we begin to understand a little bit. So he would say we must, and then those were the times where he says elimination of war was an absolute chimera. It's an absolute illusion. The gospel of universal peace and goodwill among men, for without a universal and entire mutual goodwill, there can be no real and abiding peace, has never succeeded for a moment in possessing itself of human life during the historic cycle of our progress, because morally, socially, spiritually, the race was not prepared, and the poise of nature in its evolution would not admit of its being immediately prepared for any such transcendence. That is the conclusion. That at that time, the human race was not prepared for any of this universal and mutual goodwill. So we have to again bring in a new element, the element of social evolution. That society progresses. So we cannot say why Kurukshetra war was not peaceful. Because the society itself had never heard of this question of a universal, entire, mutual goodwill. You see, society has to go through a process of purification. The vital elements in the human nature had to be brought out. So why do we human beings take such a long time? Because there are these stages of the physical, the vital, the mental, and then the spiritual. You cannot attain to spirituality right on day one. We as the so-called disciples also we have not become spiritual, if at all anything there is of spirituality on day one. In spite of knowing the mother, in spite of seeing the mother, in spite of reading the life divine, in spite of just reading the Savitri, then and now, are we all transformed into social beings or spiritual beings? No. We know the truth of Savitri, we know the truth of life divine, but are we all spiritual? Spiritual in the fundamental sense of having realized a psychic being. That is spiritual because you contact the spirit. Rest of it is not spirituality. It is moving towards a preparation for. It's only one who is based on the spirit called the psychic being, he is spiritual or she is spiritual. Rest of us, we are under the shadow of spirituality, aspiring for spirituality. Because I would not like to mince the word spirituality means, when you say materialism, we connect it to matter. All philosophy of life connect to matter. So when I say spiritualism, why don't you connect it to the spirit per se? And not all this question of the functions of the pujas and the celebrations and the ceremonies. What have they got to do with the spirit? They are only a kind of an external paraphernalia which the human's mind and the vital enjoy. So spirituality is based on spirit, just as materialism is based on matter. So what I want to say is that in spite of knowing all the knowledge is last so many decades, we as children knew, now you as adults know, other youngsters know. But there is a pattern of the being's growth. The whole being needs an expansion and self-fulfillment. You see, there are vital tendencies in us, there are mental ambitions in us, there are physical possibilities in us, which nature has to work itself out, because it is not, spirituality is not renunciation and going and saying, oh, from now I'm 24 years, I'm taking to spirituality, I'm sitting in meditation and I'm following this or that. But all that is external, your vital being wants it. But true spirituality is working through all this, the physical, the vital, the mental. Spirituality is not a kind of a pressure cooker cap that really stops you from growing. On the contrary, it allows the fulfillment of your svabhava. That is true spirituality. What your nature is, what your bent of nature is, bring it out. Spirituality is the best word for a self-manifestation. That is true spirituality. One which stops you from self-manifestation in the name of God, in the name of religion, that is pure religion or pure ethics or morality at best. So if you want to call ourselves spirituality, we have to grow through the manifestation, of course based on the consciousness of the spirit. But to call oneself a spiritual man, I think we are miles away. If you call yourself a vital man, you are absolutely identified with it. Because we have every moment a vital desire, a vital want, a vital this thing, a vital quarrel, a vital misunderstanding. It's all vital. Rejection of this, acceptance of this prejudice and that prejudice is all vital. So what I want to say in simple words, I'll take it up later, is that human society too, like the individual, grows through stages. So spirituality cannot come when the human society is at a physical vital level. So Kurukshetra could not have been avoided because at that time the society was not prepared for a spiritual ideal. Right? We'll have a short break now and come back.